All right, so we're gonna let some stragglers come in, but hello everyone and welcome to Bard Graduate Center. My name is RJ Maupin and I'm a second-year master's student here. In case this is your first time visiting us, BGC is a research institution dedicated to the exploration of human history through our material world. This building houses our library, study collection, and classrooms that all support our graduate programs. And just down the street is BGC's gallery, which holds a rotating exhibition every semester in line with our object-oriented pedagogy. And so just last week, we opened the exhibition Sev Extraordinaire, so I recommend you come back and visit at some point in the future. Sorry. One of my favorite things about BGC is that it's this vibrant hive that's always bustling with new and different kinds of scholars doing really unique research. And having come to BGC with a craft background in stained glass and a pursuit to study 20th century glass history, I was also drawn to how this institution encourages the link between making and knowing. When I learned about BGC's yearly Paul and Irene Hollister lectures on glass, which you're all here for tonight, I became thrilled to invite tonight's speaker, who began pursuing a glassblowing education in the early 2000s to enrich her ethnographic research about materiality, embodied practice, and community. Tonight, though, we will step back to look at the natural minerals and processes that make this craft possible. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Erin O'Connor, an associate professor of sociology and affiliate faculty of environmental studies at Marymount Manhattan College. She is a 2023 recipient of the Raycow Grant for Glass Research at the Corning Museum of Glass and the author of Firecraft, Art, Body, and World Among Glassblowers. Today, she will discuss some themes from this book, as well as her current book project, titled The Middle Mineral and the Mine, an Ethnomineralogy of Studio Glassblowing, which repositions the history of the American studio glass movement through its extracted mineral traces. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Erin O'Connor.
Thank you. Thank you to Bard for the invitation to give tonight's Hollister lecture on glass. Thank you, RJ. I would also like to thank the Craft History Workshop and Urban Glass Academic Symposium, where I presented earlier versions of this talk, as well as the Corning Museum of Glass for a 2023 Raycow Grant for Glass Research, which launched this project, and the Marymount Manhattan College Faculty Scholarship Award, which funded further research. Most importantly, I would like to acknowledge and thank the folks in Appalachia, the site of my research. It's because of their support and open-mindedness that I've been able to conduct this research and present it to you tonight. And I really mean that from my heart. They're very generous folks. What you see before you here is the south slope of a mountain of a silica mine in Appalachia. A silica mine is not the typical start of a presentation on studio glassblowing, but it's here that I'm starting today. In fact, for artists who work with glass, it's the de facto start. This mine, Silica Mountain, is one source of silica for glass batch. That mix of raw ingredients produced for the American studio glass market in the United States. It's one of many such mines that supply glass ingredients. Unloading batch back in the mid-2000s when I conducted fieldwork for my first book on embodied knowledge in glassblowing, I remember the pallets loaded into the back of the truck, as described by Eloise, who was a studio tech at the time, quote, "Delivery was once a week. The batch would come on a truck with a lift gate on the back. We would have to take the pallet jack and put it in the elevator and go and get it. It was like 100% of the elevator, like exceeding the capacity of the elevator. It was thousands and thousands of pounds. The pallet would be perfect on the lift gate, but you'd have to push a button to lower it. If it was wonky, it'd move around. There was one time it wasn't straight and it fell off the side, and we had to clean up toxic glass from the middle of the street," end quote. I actually remember that day and the mounds of white powder in the street. I helped to sweep it up, not giving a single thought to its composition or its origins. The only thing I had learned about it was its name, spruce pine batch. As I spent years writing about learning to blow glass, the bodily experience, the tools, the hot glass, the teamwork, the camaraderie, I constantly reference the medium. You're all here to talk about glass, its material properties, and the ways of being and knowing that it evoked. In my field notes, I describe batch deliveries, studio technicians charging the furnace, the moments of studio life when batch was in short supply, and rumors of a studio shutdown spread like wildfire. But so interwoven, identified, and focused was and is the studio life of glass, with the logic of production, with making stuff, that it never crossed my mind to think about the batch itself. This isn't my oversight alone, and it wasn't. In the field's critical literature, the material life of batch does not play a role amidst artist biographies and aesthetic analyses of glass objects. The choice to tell the choice to tell the stories of American studio glass from the vantage of human biographies and objects reveals a deep seated dualism between human creativity and natural science, between the human and the non human, between form and material. This polarizes glassmaking, I argue, that mining and mixing of ingredients and glass blowing, making objects, as well as privileges an idea of the human as both an individual and self determining agent. In tonight's talk, I push the history and contemporary critical discourse of studio glass beyond the human. This is the post-human, to understand the formation of glass objects and the ongoing formation of the earth as two sides of one creative process. In this, I offer what I call a symgeologic reading of American studio glass, namely an account of the co-becoming of the human and the geological that interweaves the human experience of self-determination and creativity with that of the living and dying ecological world. Most studio glass blowers know, there we go. Most studio glass blowers know the canonical and off-cited history of the birth of studio glass, dated 1962 to 1964. It commences with the 1962 seminar workshop in glass held at the Toledo Museum of Glass during the week of the University of Wisconsin-Madison spring break. Right? It wasn't even during a class or anything. It's like spring break. Let's have a glass workshop. Photos like these that show Harvey Littleton to the right, who was then a ceramics professor at Madison and widely recognized pioneer of studio glass, and that's a term to which we'll return later. They show him gathering glass out of the furnace, and a student to the left here is assisted by the factory worker Harvey Leafgreen. These are two of the most familiar photos of the start of the studio movement. Another off-cited fact is the use, I hear some chuckles in the crowd, everybody recognize these marbles, the use of Johns Manville number 475 marbles. After multiple attempts to melt a successful batch here, which wasn't working, Dominic Labino, who was then vice president for research and development at Johns Manville, a glass factory, suggested that they melt these marbles. And this is a form of color. It was used in fiberglass. It worked, and early studio glassblowers melted the cullet for the next decade. From this inception, the arc of the history of the field unfolds through the standard institution building. You know, university art programs, exhibitions, juries, fairs, auctions, networks of supply, demand, production. These are just scans from the Harvey K. Littleton papers at the Smithsonian Institute of Archives of American Art. And you can see that they consist primarily of requests for funding such pursuits. I want to build a glass program. I need the media. I need this. I need that. It's all about institution building. He was a consummate institution builder. As the narrative of human experimentation, right? Here I am, I'm experimenting, I'm trying it out. This has never been done in a studio before. In institution building, The history of the studio glass movement branches out from the Toledo workshops, asking newcomers to find a place on the family tree, predominantly white, male, and middle and upper middle class. And this is from the Lingard book on studio glass. 20, and you'll see it's not the greatest skin, but Harvey's in the middle, it branches out, and then you have smaller trees branching out from or coming up from the ground on either side, but primarily in the middle is the workshops and Harvey and everybody who comes from that. Interestingly, 20th century philosopher Gilles Deleuze and psychoanalysis Felix Guattari point to the ubiquity of tree logic in Western thought, namely a logic that hierarchically unfolds from deep structure in arborescent genealogy, right? It has a single origin. It's linear, it's teleological. This is problematic for them because it explains dynamics and processes of becoming in terms of an end retrospectively, right? From what is achieved, then you go back and explain, assimilating difference into identity according to that fixed point. When the emergence of studio glassblowing is explained in terms of heritage, for example, it performs this tree logic. And I couldn't be luckier to have found an actual tree in a book to illustrate it. That's how ubiquitous it is you just open up the book and it's right there. You don't even have to make it up. Yet, even in the canonical narrative, there are loose ends, clues, if you will, to stories that did not get told or were forgotten or hidden. And I don't think this is necessarily about adding more folks to the tree. This is about undoing the tree logic, even though that is also important. But in this case of studio glassblowing, the one thing I turn to is Littleton's retirement to Spruce Pine, North Carolina in 1977, which is an oft-cited fact, and it's used mostly as a chronological bookend to his time teaching in Madison. His founding of the Spruce Pine Batch Company less than 10 years later receives even scanter attention, and it is with but the briefest mention by his biographer that she even mentions that he founded the Batch Company. In a tree logic, Spruce Pine and Spruce Pine Batch are subsumed, that is, within the biological and chronological story of human intentionality and achievement. So the idea of the tree and the human is coming from one center toward one end and then retelling the story in retrospection. What happens if we climb down from the tree altogether, right, and follow these quietly tacit non-human actors, right? So it's moving out of a human genealogy towards something different. A cursory interest in spruce pine and batch, followed up by nothing less than a Google search, readily reveals that spruce pine is a gem of a city in the Spruce Pine Mining District. So ubiquitous are the minerals of spruce pine that American journalist Elizabeth Colbert began a 2023 New Yorker article called Plundering the Planet's Resources exactly there in spruce pine. Without spruce pine, she wrote, the global economy might well unravel. Spanning 300 square miles of the North Toe River Valley in Blue Ridge Mountains, the 12 miles wide by 25 miles long area in the northwest corner of the state is famed for its mica, kaolin, which is a type of clay, quartz, and feldspar. It was following a 1974 Brazilian embargo on quartz exports that spruce pine actually became one of the largest suppliers of high purity quartz in the global market. The regions, and I smiled just because when I found this, I was just like, you're joking. I couldn't believe it. It was just so loud and screaming and apparent for attention. The region's quartz is used to make the crucibles in which most semiconductors and silicon chips are made. All contemporary information technology is tied up with it, including this screen, all of your phones, this screen, everything in this room. As a sociologist committed to empirical research, the living history of spruce pine's mineral abundance was more than obviously primed for a ready, immediate, imperative connection to those mounds of batch that I had swept up in the middle of the street. There is no way that this was a coincidence. Investigating this I should say, I've done it, begun to do it, meant moving from a very human or anthropocentric framework to what I call an anthrogeological one. It meant moving from human temporality. Here I am, this is me, I'm the beginning, I was born, and there's the rest of it going out. It meant getting off the tree of human temporality, right? That arc of intentionality and action. And I could talk about phenomenology and all of that, and how phenomenology is caught up in embodied knowledge, but it meant moving beyond that to the deep time in which all of that is caught up, right? So intentionality, you have the intention, you have the goal, and this is the human arc of action. This is human temporality. But it meant getting beyond that to the deep time, the geological time in which it's caught up. Deleuze and Guattari write, every mind is a line of flight. And theorists of craft and embodied knowledge love to talk about following the matter, that, the following the flows of the matter. We all cite it. It's exciting. Yes, I followed the glass. Yes, it's a dialogue. But it's not even 20 lines later that there's this line about a mine. I've never heard it cited before, right? So they write, every mine is a line of flight. And they have these other wild things, minerals intertwined with all of becoming, right? They are arguing this with grasses, with plants and animals, including us, right? The pivot in my research towards mines and minerals follows this pan-metalism, right? It's a pan-metallurgy. The metallurgy is extending across all forms of becoming. In doing so, it weaves human efforts and their outcomes, that human intentionality or craft in this case, with those of the ongoing formation of the earth, terraforming. And there's another use of the word terraforming where it's like you're forming, Mars or the moons into something Earth-like. In this case, I'm looking at the actual forming of the earth here on the earth. And this interweaving offers, arguably, I would say, a new ethics for craft amidst today's ecological concerns. In other words, we have to get off the human track of temporality and into an anthrogeological one. Driving into Spruce Pine from Asheville, North Carolina, one passes rock quarries, stone cellars, monster trucks parked with 7 feet tall tires, and up a switchback road that reveals the ancient beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains of the larger Appalachian Highlands. Billboards, here we are up the road, filled with trucks everywhere, minerals everywhere. You pass billboards advertising gems, tourist mines, a museum of minerals, as well as I said, semi-trucks loaded with freshly quarried stone. Northbound, a mountain white with deforestation and extraction appears. This is the Quartz Corporation, one of the largest global conglomerates of high-purity quartz mining in the world. On a residential side street, not far away, land carved by mining left the ground sparkling. I saw that glint elsewhere. Mica mixed with feldspar and local pegmatite, which is a composite of rocks, had been so much part of the local mining industry that its shimmering flakes literally floated in the air at the intersections where vehicles would kick up dust long accumulated from heavy truckloads. And I thought I was hallucinating when I first saw this. I'm like, there's glitter floating into my open window of my car at the intersection. No, that is actually what happens, which was beautiful, but not okay. Also, mines, minerals, and the discarded stuff of their making permeates the everyday in spruce pine, right? So it's just, getting to this scale here of decentering the human. And that's me coming in, and this was an exploratory mind, decentering, repositioning, thinking of the mind. I mean, this is deep time. Look at that. It's a giant chasm. And how do we become with that? Unsurprisingly, the neighboring Belgian-owned Sibelco mine notes, quote, mining is in the DNA of spruce pine. They're currently implementing a $200 million investment to double their capacity to produce high purity quartz by 2025. A mineral legacy is written literally into the town's streets that are named diamond, amethyst, opal, crystal, alongside those of a bygone timber industry. I hope it's coming through here that this is not a coincidence. Flying over the Spruce Pine Mining District just a month ago, this deep-seated legacy was more than visible, right? So you see the quartz core mine there and the Sibelco. The whole land of spruce pine is carved in this way. Later in the afternoon, I crossed paths with a man wearing a bright green neon work shirt labeled Quartz Corp at a local grocery store. As I flew over the mines, he had been mining, processing, or hauling somewhere in the mine. And obviously, the discrepancy in power dynamics here is glaring. These jobs, miners variously describe as okay, dangerous, good, requiring attention, and what their family had done before them. One had lost a father who spent his life jackhammering feldspar to silicosis, while another had lost more uncles and best friends than he could count on one hand. Each of them moved with a job in the mine that paid better, be it mica, feldspar, silica, or otherwise. Local prosperity, this is international conglomerate. Local prosperity is not tangible, however, as the railroad built explicitly to haul minerals out of Spruce Pines, Mitchell County, still exists and does so. On a sunny late August day in 2023, Greg, a contemporary studio glassblower and the operations manager of Spruce Pine Batch, and I visited Mountain Silica, the mine from which Spruce Pine Batch sources some of its silica. Knowledgeable in sourcing materials and glass chemistry with an undergraduate training in cultural anthropology, Greg understood the value of seeing the mine firsthand. It was, as he well knows, the primary source of studio glassmaking practices, but all but ignored. Of warm and welcoming disposition with a smile to match, Greg introduced me to Kyle, the sales representative with whom he works, who in turn introduced us to Bob, a mining engineer who would be giving us a tour that day. Bob loaded us into his heavy-duty four-wheel truck and began the ascent up the steep incline to the top of the mountain through scrub oak, pine, sumac, and rubble. Now and then, a small footbridge would appear, connecting the road to a piece of still forested land. Bob explained that while the mine doesn't own the land, but rather leases it from the landowners who retain rights of access and also receive royalties from the mining. At the top of the mountain, shared with community service radio towers for fire and public broadcast systems and whatnot, it's easy to take in the valley's rolling beauty alongside Bob's geological explanation of the Clinch Mountain Group, which is sandstone running down from Mountain Silica 400 miles before rising up again in the northeast of Virginia. Bob is a walking and talking encyclopedia of silica mining. He drove us between the benches, that man-made topography of leveled mountain tiers, right? So you can see the levels. Again, these are not the pictures you normally see in a studio glass presentation. On one particular stop, he showed us holes drilled into the bench, about 30, in preparation for, in the industry lingo, pulling the shot later in the week, which means dynamiting the bench, right? So if you go here, I'm gonna be careful. This part, oh no, I have my magic mouse. Where is it? This part here, you see it here, is a bench. And they would put 30 holes in any one of these benches. And here you see they're working this bench because of the excavator there. And then they would pull the shot. Next to the holes are the small mounds of powder-like crushed rock brought up from drilling, right, for the silica. And it's not unlike the sawdust that accumulates around a drill bit when you're going through a board. Bob picks up the powder and let it run through his hands by way of demonstration when we were standing there. See, he said, you can tell it's good. Look how white it is. They had pulled a shot that morning that we arrived, reducing a large segment of the mountain in front of us to the right to anywhere between 9 and 15,000 tons of rubble. This is a piece of, you can pass it around, but I really want my silica rock back. It's one of my treasures. So that's a piece of it from the shot pulled that morning. Parked ready for the next morning's haul. You can see it here. Again, the excavator was one of the many extraordinary earth moving machines on this mountain. The tires are like $200,000 a piece. They haul 60 tons of silica. And I have a story about hauling silica that I can tell another time too. Parked ready was one of those machines, iconic yellow Caterpillar 530 excavators, 320 hydraulic excavators, 326 long arm excavators, and 988 large wheel loaders, among many others. After pulling the shot, the silica is collected and hauled, crushed, and sent down conveyor belts designed to process 300 tons an hour. From there, it's sifted and crushed again. So it's coming down the escalator here. It's sifted and crushed again, washed, dried, and sent into the rod mill. Here it's been crushed in the jaw crusher. This is what the beginning of what they call glass sand. It's sent into the rod mill. Well, here I'll just go through it. Here it's coming off of that glass sand, and they have many piles, and the machine is taking it over where it's piling up. This is the dryer where it gets dried, right? There's a process of cleaning it, crushing, cleaning, drying. From the dryer, it goes up into the silo, and from there it's finished into one of the mesh or particle sizes offered for sale. In studio glass, you probably heard it's typically 325 mesh. This is the kaolin or clay trailings. Trailings are a big deal. They make up mountains unto themselves. That's removed from the silica process for glass blowing. Here you can see many types of glass. This would be an example. You can see it's the pure, the less pure, and the least pure. That would be for equestrian tracks or golfing or something like that. And then finally, here you have the different types of hauling trucks. In the front, you have a pneumatic truck. In the back, you have a regular haul truck. So there's this elaborate system for obviously mining and getting the silica off the mountain. I visited the mountain exactly 1 year later, sleeping nearby, desperately hoping to hear a shot pulled. It didn't happen, but I was hoping. I woke up in the morning to a bucolic lakeside scene complete with a fishing heron. Swimming out into the smoky Mere Still Lake, I took in the sunrise to the east and looking north, noticed a new notch in the mountain's ridge. Indeed, heading up that same access road a few hours later, the mountain began to appear entirely different than the year prior. Bob explained that they had opened it up because they knew through surveys and labs from prospecting holes that it was one of the highest quality areas on the mountain. I asked him about the shots pulled on the day that I had visited last year. This all, he said, waving his hand toward a clearing onto the fields below. The last time you were here, this was trees, and there was a bunch of dirt. So we took out the trees, and we've exposed all the rock and started mining the other side. So this is going around to that notch where I'm looking from the lake, which wasn't there the year prior. That here we're driving up to the other side of the notch. So it's like if you're here, the lake is to the right and the mountain is to the left. So they're going around the other side of the mountain. The cartography of mountain silica represents what anthropologist Catherine Yusoff calls white geology, which is a discipline that makes legible a set of extractions from particular subjects and ecologies of place. Isolating minerals of use, white geology, a practice in a way of thinking intertwined with settler colonialism, designates the wanted from the unwanted. So my point here in showing you these slides is not to set up the mining industry as a straw man to be toppled or to cancel studio glass blowing or batch making because of resource extractivism. I think either of these would fail to attend to the complex and layered intricacies by which all of our lives are implicit in part of global mining industry. The mining industry's two biggest customers, in fact, are architectural and automotive glass. In any of the windows, maybe those that we walk through right here at the front of this building, or the ones in your taxi, if you were lucky enough to get one across town on today's General Assembly, the silica could have come from mountain silica. The tons of finely ground silica quartz purchased yearly for studio glassblowing is minuscule compared to industrial demand. Mountain silica would not mine and mill to meet the batch needs of studio glassblowing. It simply wouldn't be profitable. In the canon, studio glass prides itself on its liberation from the factory, right? If you're familiar, it's like, I took glass, Harvey Littleton, out of the factory and into the studio. That's the narrative. But that narrative, and if you think back to what I was saying in the beginning, is possible only from a human-centric perspective, right? That is, Littleton did do that. That's not a question. That did happen. But if we take a post-human turn, an anthrogeological turn, we have to recognize that studio glass is codependent or dependent on industrial mining, not independent from it. Right, the site, the location of the studio, or the scale that is, does not render one not complicit, right, with the mining industry. So it doesn't lessen the urgency of addressing the question of mining and minerals. Why and how, though, are mining, minerals, and the consequent batch making not unlike the mountains themselves, forgotten and ignored amidst the production of objects in art world discourse? So in order to answer this, I'll look in two directions: the ontoepistemology of settler colonialism in the early moderns, and concurrently the concept of the artistic medium. And this, I'll be brief on this kind of overview. At the top of Mountain Silica, the beauty of the lakes doesn't readily tell the story of their settlement. In 1775, though, from the neighboring Clitchfield Mountain to the west that Bob had pointed out as part of the mining topography, no one other than Daniel Boone and William Bean. I know, it's true, and there's pictures of Daniel Boone. It's just too real. It's too good to be true. They prospected the land situated at the crossroads of the Wilderness Road and Seneca Trail for settlement. Nearby is the Cumberland Gap, a fabled low-lying passage followed by Boone in 1769, and consequently 250,000 western-bound settlers. Settlement, post-colonial theorists argue, is defined by entitlement to land. So in this sense, it's different from pure resource extraction, say in the case of the British Empire, and economic gain. And here I'm really indebted to the work of critical Indigenous theorist Dina Gilio Whitaker, who, As Long as Grass Grows, is her book. I highly recommend it. Dina Gilio Whitaker, drawing from Vine Deloria and others, points out that the settler-colonial relation to the land is philosophically caught up in an early modern worldview, the two bedrocks of which are, not surprisingly, Descartes' dualist understanding of the human and world and Newton's mechanistic theory of the physical world. Both were authored in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Descartes, of course, theorized that humans are acting, rational, knowing subjects capable of choice and will, and that the world is an inert, unknowing matter. Newton's physics described the physical world as a mechanical system moved by forces. So together, the Cartesian Newtonian worldview permits something very special in the history of man's relationship to land. Namely, it permits man to understand himself as a discoverer, right, and knower of the laws of the physical world. And so disposed, and this is the important point that Gilio Whitaker and others are trying to make, to master it, right? When you can know the laws, when you can discover them and know them as a subject intending agency, you can thereby master it. Much of what operates as common sense in the industrialized West stems from this worldview. Our ideas of free world, of walking through a free will, of walking through space, of private property, and even the idea of sustainability. And this is very important, especially in the very good cause to read Indigenous environmental theory, because the idea of sustainability that is arguably a hope to preserve resources for future generations. Now, if that sounds like common sense, it's because we've internalized a settler colonial relationship to land. It's not living, it's not animated, it's a resource that must be preserved. Understanding this worldview is vital to understanding how the canonical story of studio glass gets told, not only because it enables resource extractivism or extraction, but because it subsumes that extraction, right? Again, we're trying to address why we don't hear this story within greater causes like science, art, and culture. The quieting of the life of land, its agency and power, I argue, also informs the idea of the medium. So this is the ontoepistemology, thinking of the mastering of the land as a resource, right? It's not a living agent. And the anthropological point of view is trying to move in a new materialist way toward understanding that land as having a gentle power. So glassblowers nearly unanimously refer to glass as a medium. This is something I brought up in the beginning. The use of medium in relation to art is not a natural given, however, but rather emerged with the aesthetic theory of the 18th century. Firstly, German philosopher Gottfried Ephraim Lessing used the medium to designate the unique spatiotemporality of an audience experience with artwork, while German idealists G.W.F. Hegel used the term to designate the actual material of an artwork. What's important to note is that in both cases, the medium, true to its Latin root, meaning intermediary or middle, mediates the human experience and expression as something between two discrete ontological entities. I am a person, I am expressing myself, and the medium is a medium, the middle of my expression. In the new, and I'm going to relate this back to the agency of the minerals and mines, in the new 20th century aesthetics of Littleton's time, artists sought to liberate a given medium from ideas to express the immediacy of sensations, experience, and plasticity. Abstract expressionism and so forth. But this liberation doesn't question the concept or pragmatics of medium, something that's forged or amalgamated in the case of glass in the furnace. So if we return to the Toledo workshop beginning again, we can now, I want to take note that such a beginning right here with the furnace, right, there's no mines. We've lost all our mines. We've lost all the minerals. We're beginning with the furnace. This is interwoven with an ontoepistemology, a modern, and by modern I mean Descartes and Newton, a modern ontoepistemology and its prejudices, right? That's about the human mastering the land, an idea of the land as resource, an idea that starts or begins with the conversion of that stuff into a vehicle or medium of human expression. Indeed, the primacy of man in the furnace can be seen in glassmaking illustrations over time. Littleton's was not the first. Mandeville's Travels here, this is 1410 on the left. Interestingly, you still have some of the mine in the background. It's backgrounded, but it's there. And you see the linden trees, you see the actual mining, you see people hauling the materials. And this very enviable hair glassblower in the front with the tousled hair, he's foregrounded, sure. And I do think this is marking a turn to the modern period, but that is still included. Agricola to the far right is 1556. This is in the northern German tradition. But in the background, I was very struck by the fact that the trees were leafless and blocked off to a great extent. And the furnace had gained a lot of momentum in the foreground. So it's like from here, the life of the background is kind of increasingly disappearing. And in the center, this is a couple years prior, it's Biringuccio from 1540, so 16 years prior to Agricola. But in that time and context, he's in the middle of the Italian Renaissance, right? We have the furnace complete front and center. There's no trees with leaves or without, no indications of the mine. To the contrary, you have a man in the right with that nice feather in his cap, indicating that he's learned and cosmopolitan. And you have this window to the left here, which is the Rui. And I was just in Venice and I saw these windows in a palazzo. They were amazing. I should actually have that picture here for you alongside, because you actually look through it in the optics, you can see the blown glass, and it expands the world. It is an optical window. And then you have all of these. So you see them, and it's shaped just like that. So these are indications of the Renaissance, and the furnace in this case is front and center. It's clearly a human turn that's only made more palpable in the Butteri's Medici glass workshop, which is from 1570, right? And here, this is just, I have what is zoomed in on the furnace, but the furnace, so they're actually right where that label is. There are some guys, mixing some glass, but they're so hidden. They're just not. The big deal is the furnace, the people coming in from outside who are discussing politics and philosophy and economy. It's a very humanist turn. Here we have a Medici. You can't see it quite well, but he's examining a glass object, right? What's the meaning of life? What is the earth formed? And in the above left, there's a rafter. It's not visible in this zoom in, but it has some wood. But all of this is extraordinarily peripheral to the human and the question that the human is able to pose through the medium of glass, right? We've lost the minerals. So I think Harvey's, this is not new, right? And in fact, it continues the ontoepistemology of a modern moment of understanding glass as a medium. So arguably, the primacy of the furnace in the medium performs an anachronism. It puts a second beginning, the amalgamation of minerals in the furnace first, laying the minerals of its making to waste. Learning to blow glass in the mid-2000s, I learned not to see the mineral or the mines, but there are plenty of ways that the minerals that the minerals of glass escape or exceed the medium or otherwise make themselves known. Because of time, I won't read my field notes, but one of them is the case of heat and sweat. And there was this one time when I was working the doors while I was doing my ethnographic field work, and I'd worked them for 7 hours in front of this 2,000 degree Fahrenheit furnace. And in my field notes that night, I was just covered in crystals and sweat. I had to peel everything off. It was impossible. I had to wash my hair twice. It was just, and in that moment, right, I noticed that something about, there was an inexact analogy between the salt's crystalline structure of my sweat and glass's random molecular structure, right? There was some type of vitreous metabolism or an intimacy with hot glass that I had not yet known. It was like becoming glassy in this moment. I bring this to your attention because it inaugurated a post-human turn in my thought about making, embodiment, and knowledge, right? Of salty crystal, how could I not notice the depths to which the glass was rooted in the extractive industries that afforded becoming glass, right? Through becoming crystal-y and glass-y, it made me turn my attention to this. This is not about inviting the non-human into the realm of human sociality. That's loud. That's okay. It's not a matter of inclusion. It's instead pointing to the very real symbiogy of a human lithic becoming. Another way you could think about this is the symbiotic, right? We're only 10% human body cells, and the 90% are bacteria and fungi and such. So like the symbiotic, the symgeologic refuses the boundaries between the human and the geologic. So with this in mind, I'm going to turn to two historical cases. One is the Chestnut Flats mine and Kona plant in Appalachia. And these beginnings inaugurate a very different one than that of the Toledo workshop. The first concerns Chestnut Flats, which is a feldspar mine in the spruce pine region. It's here that in the winter of 1934 that two scientists from Corning came to find pure quartz for the polymer telescope, which was then known as the Glass Giant, and it was the world's largest at the time. Here it is at Chestnut Flats. You can see the mining geologist there, Alex, is pointing what the gray right above, it's between uranium, and what's below, that's the quartz vein. And this is the two mouths of the mine. So about 18 miners carved, hand carved or hand cobbed quartz from this mine. I don't know how, I know some of it's traveled to Corning. I don't know how it was unloaded in Corning, but I do know, here it is, that it was poured there, and that no one less than Harvey Littleton was present for its pouring, because his dad was a glass scientist at Corning who worked on borosilicate glass and this lens. He may have even been present at the fanfare farewell of the lens as it left Corning. So my post-human question here, thinking about the anthropological, is how could Littleton's early contact with spruce pine quartz not be caught up in the eventual batching of in spruce pine? Could the purity of the quartz not have contributed to the purity of the idea of ready-made batch? And a lot of studies from neuroscience as well as archaeologists show now that the human mind is coextensive with matter. So if we look to this beginning, and think about the mining at Chestnut Flats, we can start to think differently of Littleton's engagement with studio glass from a geologic perspective, right? Going back to the Chestnut Flat mines. Another example is that of Mark Pizer in his early batch making in studio glass. And this is Mark in his batch room in his home. It's when you meet Mark, it's very easy to think about him younger than his 80-some years. He's constantly engaged in all kinds of residencies and projects and conversations regarding glass. When I was talking to Mark at a local cafe, that was the first time I'd heard of Kona. Kona, depending on who you talk to, is a mine, a processing plant, something or another. But Kona, this is from the aerial photo just a month ago. The plant burnt down in 2006, but Mark would go here to Kona and collect what were called Kona finds, right? And these are the Kona finds. I can pass them around. I also want my finds back. Who has my rock? A 1969 report, I'm going to find you, by the North Carolina Department of Conservation and Development indicates that Kona started mining in 1964. And to cut to the short of it, it processed feldspar through a froth flotation process, which was only discovered in 1939. Here are the finds. So, eager to pack Kona's figurative history, Alex, the mining geologist, explained the process. Mica floats is removed, then iron floats, then the last float cells where the feldspar floats, and the quartz sinks. So we think Mark needed the silica. Reflecting on Kona's industrial history, Pizer remarked, feldspar just wasn't in my lexicon. The sands we were getting were just called fines. Fines, it turns out, were the waste glass, which is what I'm passing around. In the late 60s, the fines must have been abundantly available for local Penland. Penland is a craft school there. There's also a mining history to be told with that institution for another time. They must have been abundant. But the special thing about these finds and Mark's batch making from it is that they were the best. It was the best glass that any studio or glassblower had seen at that time. It was brilliant. It had luster. It melted well. It worked well. But in reflecting upon this, what Mark knows now, what he didn't know then, it wasn't the purity of the quartz, it was its impurity because the feldspar acted as a flux, creating a lower melting temperature and more brilliant glass, right? So in the case of Littleton, you have this kind of purity of the quartz mine with these large veins of quartz and the establishment of batch as a medium, a ready-made medium. And Mark, you have this impurity. As you can see, the dirty finds, I'm not sure how much cleaner they were in 1968, to mark a different trajectory From a sim geological perspective, the Chestnut Flats quartz and Kona finds can be understood as having animated two different trajectories of the development of studio glassblowing. The former, the purest, toward a medium, the latter, impure, toward making creation through following the mineral life, right? Mark had eyes and ears to follow the feldspar, so to speak, without even knowing it at the time, right? It was led by the mineral in that case, was not a medium. In bringing this perspective to the contemporary moment, I have learned to batch glass. And with this, I'll be concluding. In this, oh, there's more feldspar. It's hard when you get to mines, you just love them so much. In this, I felt the smooth powdered silica sand and feldspar. This is me at the mixing station. The granulated soda ash and slick potassium carbonate, among other minerals underhand. At times, I mix batch, essentially gather the ingredients of the glass recipe. So here, mixing, that's feldspar, local feldspar, still from the spruce pine region. The Global Supply Chain of Minerals is a paper that is ready to be written by me momentarily. Here you mix it into the hopper, the small minerals station, the rare earth station. Here it's coming through the hopper into the agglomerator, which any of you who have ever charged a furnace with spruce pine batch would recognize this. I hope I made you a good batch. Other times, like I said, I would work the agglomerator. Within an hour of work, I'd be dusty. And if working the agglomerator, my hair, face, and eyebrows would be coated by noontime lunch. Working the agglomerator was like touching the underbelly of hot glass. And I really can't emphasize what an amazing feel it was to be able to put your hands into the glass after years of only being able to touch it through tools. So it was a moment. It was a moment where you felt inside of it, or at least did. I noted in my field notes, quote, somehow it gets you inside the glass, this amazing opportunity to feel earth, if you will. By day's end, batch was just about everywhere, in the wells of my pockets, the shutter of my camera, ear canals, simply everywhere. And I empirically understood why it's used in so many beauty products, especially hairspray textures and exfoliants. Its abrasive and sculpting power is nothing short of absolute. Adjourning to a nearby river to swim after a day's work, I felt I had to dive and scrub every part of my body before I could actually swim. And like the day of working the doors where I became glassy, right? And I had this salt and sweat and the shower afterwards. I had to wash my hair in order to wash it 2 times, 3 times, upside down, backwards, scouring my scalp in the river with my nails. Only as the strong current loosened the dust grip from every crevice did I feel free and able to swim. And it was then that I noticed glimmering mica flakes intermixed with gleaming schools of shiners, curious rainbow trout, and deep dwelling smallmouth bass. So I'm getting the silica that was mixed up with the mica off my body. I dive in the water. I'm seeing mica come up from the sand in the water. It's floating. It's amongst all of these schools of shiny silvery fish. Silver on silver, sparkle on sparkle, mineral on mineral. Coming up for air and warmth, I leaned against a sunset warmed, river sculpted boulder, taking in the wild mineral metabolism that weaves the region. Silica, glass, the global mineral market and mining industry, and nothing short of the possibility of studio glassblowing. It's a profound moment when you are in that, feeling it and seeing it and knowing it. Decolonizing the history of studio glassblowing is not only about the obvious need to move on from the language of the pioneer. I told you we would come back to that at the beginning, of the maverick and the trailblazer, each of which originates with settler colonialism, often through violent means. It's also about taking up a view on nature, land, and so-called resources that dispenses with dualisms, hierarchy, and anthropocentrism, such that studio glass practice can understand itself as having emerged with the non-human, in this case, the lithic. Mediation, the creation of the medium, bears those ready gouges and gaps in the glass blower's knowledge of glass making, that chasm between the middle mineral, glass, and the mine. So with that, I'll close. Thank you so much.
Hi. Thank you so much. That was such an amazing talk, and I feel the end was just so vivid and made me feel like I was there, so I just have to say thank you for that. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is I'm really drawn to how your two projects kind of link together. One being so focused on the human and thinking about how people are gaining knowledge and glass blowing through feeling and doing, and then to take your second project, which, as you said, it's a post-human project, but still they're very different, but at the same time they're so interlinked. And oh, I'm really curious about how at what point in the research you felt the shift or the urge or the need maybe to even start this project,
Yeah,
other than what you kind of talked about already.
well, that was the moment. And I was working on a project, and if you are a reader of phenomenology and embodiment, there's a lot on intracorporeality, right? Teamwork and bodies working with other bodies and bodies working with tools. And I was working on an article for an edited collection called Studio Studies, and these were all STS folks from Europe. And then I realized, as one day I often edited on subways. I'm a big subway editor when I lived in Brooklyn. And I was like, this has nothing to do, thinking about this moment of becoming hot and sweaty, and kind of that inexact analogy of the sweat with the crystals of or with the silica of studio glass, or the soda or whatever of studio of the actual glass. Like, this isn't between bodies. Like, I am that in the moment. And through conversations with the folks in the studio studies workshop, I was introduced to the work of Karen Berard, and her idea of interaction. And all action is not being between discrete ontological agents, but an emergent phenomenon, right, that happens. And so that led me to the idea of intracorporeality. And in that, I was not only thought about the heat. My first book is a lot about the heat and hot and fire, hence Firecraft. But then I was pushed me to move beyond the heat as an element and actually look at the minerals in the mines.
So where would you say that the next step in your project is going? Because I know this book is still in progress. So what's next?
Well, next, I mean, so I started with batch, right? And that's another thing. As I was editing my book, to the first book, to submit it, it was like batch, 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 glass, 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 batch, batch, glass, glass, batch. I was like, where? No explanation. I'm like, what is this glass? How amazing that it appears in this room to be used as a medium, right? And that led me to investigate it further. And then, so I got into the batch, and then from there, I want to go into I have a whole grant, please. I hope to get it in to do further study on color and cullet. So the idea is to investigate not just where this was primarily about silica tonight, but all the minerals of potassium carbonate, the lithium. Any glass blower will know about the rising costs in lithium, potassium carbonate, which is supposed to be substitute, all of these things, the rare earths, the colors, which is the cobalt. And if anybody's using bullseye glass, you'll know what they went through a couple of years ago with the pollution in the neighborhood out in Seattle, and there was lawsuits, and it's an ongoing issue because people were having health problems. So where are these minerals coming from? How are they used? How do they animate the practice? How is the practice co-evolved with them? And then also cullet, because cullet used to be leftover glass, like those Johns Manville marbles. I mean, those were made, but increasingly some of you may be melting cullet, and it's pre-made, right? So it's melted glass, you amalgamate it, then you cut it up, and then you sell the cullet, but it's not factory waste anymore. So how has that come about? And then that is such a widely distributed case of international production. So how does that work with American studio glass and the development of international studio glass?
Yeah, I was just about to say, thinking about not just the silica mining, but all these other materials that kind of build up what studio glass is. To what extent is your project going to have to look internationally and kind of go outside of the American context to kind of bring it back around to American studio glass? Because I know a lot of the extraction is happening globally.
It will be global.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll definitely be global. And I've been looking at a history of this already. Like I've just recently spent time this year in Venice and looking at the Salviati archives there. All their silica sand was from Fontainebleau, excuse my French pronunciation. But it wasn't local, right? It was coming from France. And so looking at also the histories of the global supply chain for glass and how that worked across war. That's super interesting in the archives. The letters from the fascists to the glassmakers, and the letters from the glassmakers to the fascists during that period from Salviati, and how that interrupted supply chains. Also, the waste island that's on Murano. And the extraordinarily high levels of cadmium and whatnot that are found there.
Yeah, unrelated, but thinking more going back to the silica, I have, and forgive me for telling a personal story, but the first time I encountered batch, I was working in a gallery of a hot shop, and the first time that they were doing a charge when I was around, because they always did the charge or the melting the glass basically in the furnace, they closed the door and they warned me, don't go back there. It's super dangerous. It's the space you don't want to be around unless you have a respirator on, which is a very valid feeling of not wanting to be back there, but it kind of gave me the sense that batch in its raw form is something to be feared and kind of this, I mean, it is a dangerous material as you kind of referenced to, but I'm wondering what the connection is to this privileging of the molten or the kind of final result of the glass and not this raw material that actually when you see the pictures that you're putting up, it has this almost sublime sense where it's terrifying but also quite beautiful, and surprising that more artists haven't taken inspiration from seeing the landscape. um, I don't know if this is coming around to a question, maybe it's just a comment, but I'm just wondering what you think about that privileging of the molten, and not thinking why people haven't thought about the batch so much in the
Well,
past.
there's reasons for it, right, that are linked to like this Cartesian and Newtonian viewpoint, and those reasons are the cause of resource extraction and why it's invisible to studio glass blowers and practitioners. And I think there's a lot of talk now about sustainability, right, in glass, and how to create more sustainable practices. And I think this is valid, like that those conversations should happen. But at the same time, until we get out of that onto epistemology in which I'm a human and the world is available to me for my creation as a medium, we're not going to get beyond a resource extraction paradigm. And I think Mark's work is super interesting because Mark Pizer, because he's, when and is actually working with the minerals and creating work from the minerals out, so to speak, rather than working with a medium. And it was also interesting to me while I was doing research in Murano in January and last week, that you always go into the batch making factory area of the factories. They're not separate. They're not. It's not a such a marginalized division of labor. And in fact, it could be the first room you go to if somebody's showing you a factory. Or on the opposite side of the spectrum, it's a room that they don't let you in at all. That haven't, but because it is so important. It's the way that's the thing. That's the thing. That's the medium. That's the glass. And that's why those factories can make the unbelievable glass that they do, because they do control the minerals and the composition. So it's just a very different mode of glass making, and it gets out of like that hylomorphic mode where you're imposing a form upon a medium. And so say even we follow the glass, and I talk about this in the first book too, and it's something that we do. That's fine, but then what is that glass? What are you following? Is it just is it a medium, an intermediary between you and the expression? And are you controlling, mastering the minerals in that modern onto-epistemological way? Or are you following something therein, or creating something therein, like that kind of unknown presence of feldspar in Mark's early batch making?
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose now would be a good time to move to some audience questions. And in the spirit of generosity, we do ask you keep to like a single part, so as many people can ask questions as possible, because I'm sure many of you have things you'd like to know. So if you just want to raise your hand, and I think we'll bring a mic around to you. Yes, right here.
Oh, okay. That was a beautiful talk.
Thanks.
And so thank you for that. What I was thinking about that I would ask you is that thinking about the colonization of the materials and of the landscape from working in a Latin American country in Mexico. So my research is coming from a colonized perspective. And so as much as I really appreciate the idea that we need to take out the human, I can't forget the humans that have been colonized that are part of these extractions, because in Mexico the any mining involved extraction of human labor. And like the 90% of the indigenous that died in Mexico, it wasn't just because they were killed, and it wasn't just from disease, it was also because of they were worked till they died. So I guess what I'm leading to is that it might have you considered looking at the mines like all over and looking at them from within a colonized perspective rather than from the privileged perspective that we might have easily as colonizers.
Yes. So thank you for your question. I mean, so a couple of things here. One, direct answer is yes. So part of the research I hope to do is expanding, right, the scope of the mines that I'm looking at, not only those in the United States, but in places that have been colonized. Two, I don't want to dispense with the idea of the human, right? What my goal here is, in thinking about sim geology and anthrogeology, is to just think of the human as a lithic being, right? So how does the human become with the minerals? And there are different trajectories here, and the one that you point to is very valid. And I think that the miners who I interviewed, not that this is they're wage laborers and it's different, but in that moment where I'm like, oh, I'm flying over the mines and I have an aerial view, talk about a Cartesian Newtonian experience, right? This Archimedean view of the mines. And then I see the miner in the grocery store 3 hours later, right? These are two different experiences. And I more than what I recognize that the one that I occupied in that moment was extraordinarily privileged. So it's important to get the stories of those folks, right, as part of the book, which I've begun. And then also, like you said, to expand it. I see you? Go ahead.
Right, and also take it like Mexico was when the conquest happened. It was like the earlier before, it was like the 15th century,
Right.
and so so it's almost like even looking at that extraction at an earlier level, because for the indigenous, the minerals are the land and they are themselves. So looking, I don't know, this isn't a question, but it's sort of saying that maybe it's important to explore the indigenous perspective from the people that were extracted.
Yeah, and in my book, just I would like to go into this further, but the chapter called "The Glassy State" looks at glass making as a vehicle of imperialism, and specifically Jamestown. And there's an amazing scene from a mid-20th century publication that literally stages a battle between the Werowinants Winchachopuk and Captain John Smith before the Jamestown glass house. I wish I had the image to show you. But Captain John Smith, has his hat tossed off, Winchachopuk's bow and arrow on the ground. Captain John Smith is overpowering him, and two glassblowers are running behind with their pipes. It's the oddest thing in the world. So I look at that idea of the crucible and the furnace, and that transformation of the minerals into the medium as a vehicle of colonization. So it wasn't just the land that was colonized in the Jamestown glass house, it was the people themselves. And I talk about the consumption of the trees and the labor in that moment.
So
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. I'm excited to see that picture, just the whole book in general. But I think, Josh, did you have a question to move on to?
Thank you for this talk. Also, as a North Carolinian, I have to say thank you for spotlighting our state.
you're welcome.
My question is brief, but I'm curious how you would exhibit a history of studio glass in an art or craft museum.
I've thought about this, like had dreams. I mean, obviously from minerals. So I've thought about just the exhibitions that could happen from the mineral perspective. And it's like that museum that I went into, the Museum of Minerals, is just fascinating for me. And thinking about, connecting, it's like what there it's like, this is the quartz, this is the feldspar, and who has my silica rock? This okay, good, this is it, but then where is the human, where is the machine? And it's like with the art objects behind the vitrine in general, so I would definitely, I think performance should be part of it. Animation, graphics. I can see all types of things happening. And I think it would be so immersive and so beautiful for someone to experience, in the sense of knowing, not that it's a whole all about beauty or anything. I'm not trying to aesthetize it. But I could see it, yeah, in this fashion. And then going back historically, like Winchechopuk should be there. He really, that scene, I can't believe that's never been shown in a studio glass book. And again, it's like, we're liberated from the factory, we have nothing to do with colonization. No, 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 no. And it's so, and again, this doesn't mean we have to cancel everything. It means telling that story, making the story available, right? So that going forward, somebody can do something with it. So
Sounds like a BGC collaboration we need to have, but I don't know. We need to talk about that. But great. You have a question over here?
This is not glass, but when I see the spruce pine and the digging there, and it makes me very sad. I spent some years in outback of Australia mining opal, and it was completely mined out when the big companies came in, and the land has been scarred forever. And it's is spruce pine, can anything grow again?
I mean, Appalachia is super interesting. There's all types of reclamation projects, entailing some people. There's a saying, if you can't grow it, you have to mine it, right? So, but I know. But it is changing the landscape. This isn't mountain top removal, which is what happens in West Virginia. It's open pit mining. It doesn't make it any less scarring, as you saw from the images. And this is so interesting, because I'm like sweeping up the batch, and I'm like, spruce pine. I'm like, wait a second. Then he retired there. Wait, the batch is from there. Like the synapses are firing. And the first time I drove into spruce pine, I was like, I couldn't believe how real it was. It was so real, just the mining and how palpable. And I don't mean to be naive about it, but I hadn't been to a mining district before, which I think in this case works in my favor, because I was able to see it very obviously and connect it to this history in a way that if I had been in Meshdina, it might have had blinders on. The short answer is yes. It is scarred. The land is gone. And like I said, I don't think scale, like studio glass, we don't use that much. So it's not really the answer or the way out, because it is caught up in this greater ontoepistemology of the medium. And much broader. It's not just glass and silica, it's all types of minerals and all types of industries.
Yeah. Like you were saying, dealing with the problems of extraction and the resulting landscapes is less about the problems that studio glass has, and thinking about our whole worlds would have to change. Like you were saying, with our phones, our screens, everything is tied to this material. It would be a whole different life we would live. I mean, not that we definitely should be questioning these.
Yeah, we should be questioning, but I also don't want to be like naive.
Right.
You can get rid of it. That's not. There has to be like different.
I think it's a question over here.
Hello.
I think the most engaging phrase in your paper, because I think what you're asking the audience to do is almost impossible, which is to think, right, that there's an agency that is not human, and so title of the talk, and I think the book should be led by minerals, because it's what you've been doing, right? And it's what this guy with his funny pants in 1960 did, right? He's been, or the guy who did the very shiny glass, right? He was led by the mineral, and so I think and also when you were making your case about the indigenous people in Mexico, I mean, the human itself, right? It's led by the mineral, but you can go in that direction and become nothing but mineral, or you can go in this direction and have the fantasy, right? That your consciousness, pure consciousness, and so I think in the work that you're doing, that it should be what guides. It's the mineral should be.
Yeah.
So in this discussion, I think sustainability and the earth. There's no native with a tear looking at the landscape. I think that's not relevant to. It's about how people are driven by something other than themselves.
Yeah.
And it's so profound that they don't even see it. It's hard.
I have to tell you, standing before that mouth of the mine when I went to that geological turn, it does whisper to you. It really, when I've never gone into a mine, I'm not one of those tunnel people. I don't, no caving or anything like that. But before a glinting mouth of a mine, believe you me, it's seductive. And you want to go down. And the one with Chestnut Flats is full with uranium. The uranium is dripping. And I'll tell you what, it was November and I wanted to go for a swim. It was just something calls, and I don't mean to be not analytical about it, but there is a conversation that's had there. And actually there's folks at the Bauhaus in the school in Berlin, right, who are doing interesting work on this too, and like artwork where they're following the minerals and the rocks and whatnot. Yeah, thank you for that.
Do we have any more questions? We can go either here or here. Let's start in the back and come forward.
I'm curious about the reactions of folks from within Studio Glass to your research. Do they feel
folks from where?
From within Studio Glass.
Oh,
do they feel challenged or inspired, or?
It's been super positive, which is why I'm so extraordinarily grateful and thankful. So you can say the practitioners, I think there's an eagerness for this conversation to be had. And it's one of those things. I'm not the only one who is like, oh, batch, like, and then you hear the story of batch and spruce pine, you're like, oh, wow, this is amazing. The folks at the batch company have all read my work. I vet it through them. They give me feedback. They've been extraordinarily supportive. The folks at the mine have been extraordinarily supportive. I've sent them, the first article that's coming out on this, the videos, they've read it, they've vetted it. I even got invited back after that. So I'm very, very, very thankful. People see this as a conversation that needs to be had. It's not, it's nothing that's about canceling Studio Glass or batch making, right? It's about understanding the parameters of the art in a way that meets today's ethical mandates, right, for what could be called environmental responsibility or something like this, right? And I think it makes you a better glassblower, right? For me, it's made me a better glass thinker for sure. I can't say that it's improved my glass, my cup making, but certainly thinking about glass.
Do you think that that's kind of in line with other kinds of turns in the history of Studio Glass? That because in the time of Harvey Littleton, it was very white, very kind of like middle upper class, like had all these associations of it was sort of a man's world, like all these things that as the glass world evolves, that it's kind of there are all these shifts in trying to make it more diverse and make it more sustainable. Looking at it, it's growing and changing even outside of what your work is trying to do to the history.
Yeah, I do think so. And I think, certainly the field of Studio Glass, I talk about this in my introduction, has changed from when I started to do field work, right? It's in terms of gender and race, it's much more inclusive. Excuse me. And I think that this ecological turn, to me, I really want to emphasize that it's also about getting out of that modern onto epistemology. And I'm very inspired by the work of Dina Gilio Whitaker, whose book, As Long as Grass Grows, was a profound paradigm shift for me. Because I was like, land, 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 nature, nature, nature. And she was like, you know, what is that nature, and where are you, your positionality in relation to that nature and land? And reading her allowed me to see that indeed I was occupying a position in relation to something, and that wasn't natural. That was the heritage of a settler colonial perspective in which I'm obviously complicit. So I yeah, it's back to your point. I just really want to emphasize it's not about gathering more forces. Or she has really interesting arguments about environmental justice, and if the pie is ethically off, right, it's not about everybody getting their piece of it. That doesn't solve the issues about making different pie. So in her work, she's really pushing for this paradigm shift in understanding what it means to be human relation. Not I don't even like using the word relation anymore, but to be human is always this sim becoming with the lithic, with the biotic, with all of it, and this is kin, right? This kinship system, not so. I'm inspired by her work, and I hope not to extract from it myself, which I know is a risk.
All right, I think we had a question up here.
In all the pictures that were shown, I kept thinking about the overall health of the people that live in the area that are affected. I mean, if you came out from a day covered with this stuff, what is the health of the people that live within miles of this?
Well, I don't know if there's been a study on that, certainly from anecdotal evidence, like with the interviews of the miners. The one, his father, one, he worked in a mine, and his father, jackhammered the feldspar because that was the mineral of the day. It wasn't the feldspar that killed him, it was the silica that was, because they grow together. It's companion species. None of them grow alone. So he got silicosis and died at 62, I believe. OSHA comes in and regulates, you wear a mask. So all these places are all regulated, and you're allowed X amount of exposure. They measure the particulates in the air. It's very strictly regulated, and it's even becoming more regulated. I forget what law was just passed, but they're clamping down yet another level. So the workers are rather protected, I would say, these days. But of course, there's had the Tow River where I was swimming has had many phases of cleanup over time. The area, I mean, if mica's floating in the air at the intersection, I haven't done a study of this, but it would be interesting, and I don't know if the national government has, but it does float in the air.
My other question was, with regard to what is produced, did this land, you said that they don't own the mine does not own the land, they
Right.
lease it.
Mm-hmm.
Were there Indians that were run out of the area in order to take advantage of capitalism?
This mine dates from 1982. So it's a relatively new mine in the history of settlement, indeed. So that long history, the reason why I bring that up is because it's the settlement colonization is about the right or entitlement to land, right? It's not purely resource extraction. It's taking the land, obviously, to settle it. Patrick Wolf talks about this also. So not 1982, no, but historically, yes. And I believe that legacy does have impact today. So, I mean, urban glass, all New York City, right? Everywhere. It's all Yeah, sorry.
No, you're good. For the sake of time, I think I'm just going to ask one final question to you. And again, this is kind of, I'm not sure how to phrase it, but when you were talking about these mining towns and we're thinking about all these people who are implicated in what's happening in the mines, I'm thinking of the community members that we're talking about living in these towns, the miners themselves, animals in the surrounding landscapes, machinery, truckers, train conductor, all these people who are part of this process who may not even really understand what glass is in their day-to-day lives. But I would love to hear you talk more about this relationship between these wider networks of people and the process of co-becoming that you talk about in your paper, especially.
Well, it's like, I think about the miner the worker I saw in the grocery store, and Sabelco's comment that mining is in the DNA of spruce pine, right? So, and Mark made a comment. He's like, if you live down here, you can't avoid the mines. Like I see and hear their goddamn machines every day. This is a quote that I didn't get read, but it was in there. And so it's implicit to the imaginary in the culture and the conversations and the movement of housing and the roads and the education and the health system and the other modes of the infrastructure, the railroads. I mean, it is it is the mining, the DNA, excuse me, it is the community in many ways. Like driving up that one road, you see the high school football field, and I believe it's sponsored by Quartz Corp, if I'm not, and I forget what their mascot name is, but I see it in my mind's eye. It's there, it's everywhere. But unfortunately, I mean, if you look at the demographic information in terms of income, longevity, it's not, the county does not fare well. It's an extraordinarily poor county. So the wealth, the mining defines the community, but in a system of inequality.
Yeah.
Right. That's tied to global resource extraction. Most of that leaves spruce pine.
Well, I think we'll have to close off there. Unfortunately, it wasn't a positive end, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.